Hello. This is Caladoon, and welcome to episode 4 of Let's Analyze. Today's episode is all about the map structure of Complete the Monument maps, linear branching versus open world. Now, we'll start by discussing the advantages and disadvantages of linear branching, same with open world, and then wrap up talking about some alternative map styles that I haven't really seen used and think would be interesting. So first, we have linear branching. Now, if you've played any Complete the Monument map, then you've probably played one of these. It's by far the most popular map type. There's a huge list of them. And this was all just off the top of my head rather than, hunting for them. Now, the map's divided into sections based around intersections. Start by getting to intersection 1, which branches off into several dungeons, each with a wool or two. And one of those dungeons has a path to the next intersection, and so on and so forth. That you should be seeing the schematic in the background, and I think it's pretty obvious where both the linear and the branching terms come from. Now, sometimes this is kind of broken up or disguised a little, actually. Good example is Inferno Mines has a very, very large starting area, and later on there you're teleported to a place that feels very large and open world before it gets back to the traditional intersection structure. Another good example, in Depths of Irkalla, this entire area is intersection 2, and it's sufficiently large that, for a while, you don't even think of it as an intersection. Now, that said, most intersections tend to look more like this. So, what's the advantage of intersections? Why do we use them? Well, first off, they very clearly indicate to the player where to head next. When you come to an area that has 3 side tunnels marked with signs and an ender chest, it's very clearly saying, go down these tunnels for the rest of the game. They're almost like a level select menu, actually, for Minecraft maps, which is pretty awesome. Now, second, they give the player a checklist. Not only can you say, I've gotten 5 wool, but you can have another measure of progress by saying, alright, I've beaten intersection 1, and I'm almost done with intersection 2. It's a good way to just measure progress, I guess, which is always satisfying to kind of tick more marks off a checklist. Just human nature there. Now, third, intersections give the player downtime. You can have a nice, relaxing break, kind of, as you set up a new base, maybe run some rail lines, and just otherwise relax as you're moving stuff from point A to point B. It really gives a great counterpoint to the tension and excitement found from, fighting in all the dungeons and everything. And fourth, for the map maker, they're easy. All you have to do is lay down a giant cave, build a big bridge in the shape of a plus sign and decorate it, and call it an intersection. Now, and theoretically, this should allow the designer a lot more time to dive in and focus on gameplay. So those are all very strong positive reasons to use linear branching maps with, intersections. The biggest disadvantages of intersections, though, are that, they feel like a level select menu and are easy to make for the designers. Yeah, it goes both ways. Because when you run across an intersection, it feels like you've unlocked new dungeons and levels, sure, but it takes away from the immersion. Now, let's take intersection 3 in Depths of Irkalla, which is inside a giant Fabergé egg. It's brilliant, it's unique, I've never seen anything like that in a map ever, frankly. But I just came from a mine suspended over lava. Why does a mine connect to a giant egg? And why does the egg connect to a lava pit, a jungly cavern, and whatever the heck this place is? Now, intersections don't always have to break immersion. Spellbound Caves did well by having the cave system be, in the story, made by wizards. So, humans want logical connections, so it makes sense that they'd put little branches here and there. Dread Sky Isles also did a great job, with the intersections being junctions connecting floating islands. You need some way to get from point A to point B. And then Inferno Mines, not so much. Now, overall, this is why intersections being easy to make is a little dangerous if you aren't careful. It can just steal the immersion straight from the map. Now, I will point out, though, that sometimes you don't care about making an immersive map. Sometimes your map is first and foremost a game, and you don't care how much the player believes in your scenery and story, and you just want to kill them with your crazy custom mobs. If the core gameplay element of your map is challenge, absolutely use linear branching. Otherwise, still feel free to use it, but just be a little careful and make sure you think about why an intersection is there before you just plop it into the world. The next most common map type is open world maps, although as of late these seem to be a little less popular. In this one, the dungeons are scattered across the world, either grouped by region or just everywhere. But either way, it schematically looks like this. We can go anywhere, at any time. There's absolutely no restrictions on the player's movement. Now, the first huge advantage of open world maps is exploration. No matter where you look on the map, there could be dungeons and treasure and interesting things, so the player really wants to look around, as long as you populate your map with those things. It really is a, if you build it, they will explore scenario. And in fact, if the core engagement element of your map is supposed to be exploration, then just stop this video right now. This advantage of open world maps alone should be enough to let you know your structure. Now, second, open world maps make it very easy to encourage immersion within a map. You can have everything within a specific region be themed together and reinforce the ideas. Maybe if you have an ice dungeon, you can place it in the mountains, surrounded by snow. Or maybe take a castle or a village and put a zombie-filled catacombs beneath it, implying, where the inhabitants went and why it's abandoned. In fact, having environments such as those that aren't actively dungeons is a great way to sprinkle in environmental storytelling and lore, without having to use words. Or even feel free to use words in these, because unlike putting lore in dungeons, the player will have time to read it. Now, despite these great advantages, the downsides of open world maps are very non-trivial. First and foremost is travel time. CTM maps are big enough as is with huge areas, and it takes long enough to walk usually from one to the next. Now, if you add an interstitial overworld on top of that, the problem gets far worse. Now, like most problems, you can get around this. Provide minecart tracks, maybe well-placed teleportation stations, or even horses, actually. But it's still something to watch out for, especially if you start making areas over a couple hundred blocks long. The second big issue is the difficulty curve. Now, normally you want your map to slowly get harder over time, not just between dungeons, but from dungeon to dungeon. Here, though, the player can wander off and do dungeons in whatever order they like, breaking your carefully crafted difficulty curve. A good example, actually, my friend's his first CTM map was Sunburn Islands. And I think his dungeon order, he did Dungeon 1, then 2, then 6, then 15. Now, you can get around this, just like the other one, by here it's using good environmental and lighting cues. You can kind of subtly make paths to guide the player from point A to point B. And third, just as intersections are easy to make, open world maps can be very hard to make. If you do a map with continents, for example, not only do you have to make the dungeons interesting, but also the areas between the dungeons. You can get around this with Sunburn Islands and Vinyl Fantasy. They did it by making the intermediary spaces ocean and void, respectively. But it's something important to keep in mind if you're making an open world map and really want to emphasize that exploration aesthetic. So there's my thoughts on the pros and cons of the most popular map types, but I spent a while thinking and trying to come up with some other interesting, unusual ones, and just want to share what those are and what kind of I think about them. Now, the first main alternative I can see to these is what I'm calling linear continental. Here's the schematic, and it's actually what I'm trying to use for my map in development, kind of replacing intersections with large continents. And on each continent, the dungeons are of approximately equal difficulty, just to keep the players from wrecking the difficulty curve. Now, this has all the advantages of the open world map's environment and immersion, while still keeping the guidance of linear branching. The main downside, though, is, well, at least for me, it takes forever to make the continents, especially trying to keep every little piece interesting. Next up, gated. Now, this would be something like the lines of Metroid or Legend of Zelda, really. You have the appearance of an open world, but you can't progress past certain points without specific items, either by using hard-to-break blocks, or just a literal hopper and command block check system. Now, if you've played any of those games, you know how immersive they can be, but the gates can feel very artificial, especially if you have a bunch of them. And this might also, again, you have to be careful with it, or it'll just kind of seem like a bad Minecraft adventure map. And finally, treasure map. Now, this would be an open world map where each dungeon has directions to the next few dungeons. Now, these could be of the form as maps, coordinates, riddles, direction, or literal directions, like go this way, take a right here, etc. Now, this gives the player a mostly linear progression, which is good, but still definitely encourages that sense of discovery. I mean, what's more associated with discovery than, going and digging up treasure? Now, the downsides is that the map will break horribly if any of the directions are too hard or obscure. If the player can't find one of the dungeons that has clues to 3 other dungeons, then, well, they're essentially locked out of a huge portion of the map. Anyway, those are my thoughts on how we can structure maps for Complete the Monuments, and I'd love to hear what you think, especially about some of the more unusual ones I proposed. Now, I hope this gives you some interesting ideas for designing your maps, and of course, I also hope you enjoyed watching. This has been Caladoon, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.